Joining me today on the 105.3 The Fan YouTube channel, it is NBA draft time. So we got to talk a little NBA draft. We're going to do so with Richard Stayman. You can follow him on Twitter at Mavs Draft, credentialed NBA draft analyst, co-host of the Mavs Draft podcast also. And really good with Dalton Trigg, who, of course, runs everything with Dallas basketball with SI and everything, Mike Fisher and all those guys over there. He's like, look, Kev, you got to talk to Richard, man. You got to talk to him. He knows his stuff about the NBA draft. I said, all right, let's talk to Richard on 105.3 The Fans YouTube channel. Richard, what's going on, man?
Not too much. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, appreciate you taking a few minutes with us. Obviously, the draft is taking place on November the 18th. The Dallas Mavericks have the 18th and 31st overall picks. As you have done some of your draft analysis for this upcoming draft, who have you seen potentially as a good fit for the Mavericks for where they are? Or do you think maybe they make a move with that pick and possibly use it to acquire another talent from somewhere else?
Yeah, I think ultimately they are going to move up. But should they stay at 18, I think the priority has to be a wing. Josh Green from Arizona has really stood out to me. Defensive-minded, high motor, decent jump shot, potentially could be a 3-and-D. Really athletic, so that's super helpful as well, and the Mavs need that on the wings. Desmond Bane, just right in the Mavs' backyard at TCU. Probably the best shooter in the draft. Unbelievably strong, just built like a linebacker. So he's got the physical tools. Even with the negative wingspan, he's a positive wing. And then I would say also Aaron Nesmith from Vanderbilt is a top priority too, arguably the other best shooter in the class, if not Desmond Bane. I do think, though, that they will move up into the late lottery, probably trying to target someone like Saddiq Bey. That's my guess.
And that's been a guy who, as I've kind of gone through some of my own draft film study, if you will, as I've kind of looked into draft, that was a guy I said, look, he's a Villanova guy. Jay Wright players usually come in pretty well ready to play NBA basketball with a high basketball IQ. We got one already in a guy like Jalen Brunson, who, of course, one of the things that we lauded about him is his high basketball IQ. Do you think a Saddiq Bey could be there by the time the Mavs drafted 18, or are they really going to have to try to make a move up in the draft, potentially get into the late lottery to go ahead and get him?
Yeah, I think a lot of late lottery teams are big on Saddiq Bey. So I think that it's going to be, you have to jump those teams that are high on him. I think he's a perfect Mavs fit. He reminds me a lot of Wesley Matthews, who the Mavs absolutely loved. And if you get Wesley Matthews without the Achilles injury, it's a pretty good player.
Yeah, is a guy who I looked at, I thought too, kind of reminded me a lot of Andre Iguodala with his frame. Hopefully as good of a defender as he was, but definitely I think a better shooter than Andre Iguodala was when he came out of college. So when you look at this team overall, Richard, when you look at the Mavs as a construct, what do you see as the glaring one or two holes that this team will need to address, not just in the draft, but potentially in free agency as we get closer to that also?
Yeah, I think it starts with lockdown perimeter defenders. We saw it in the Clippers series. You need someone besides Dorian Finney-Smith because you can only do so much. And obviously Maxi Kleber is good too, but again, two guys can't control a defense. So I think having perimeter lockdown defenders is huge. And then also with potentially no Dwight Powell this year, I'd say having another big man is probably the next direction I would go. I know a lot of people are looking at guard, but I do think big man depth, you can just never have enough.
When you look at the depth at the guard position in this draft, who is a guard or two that may be sitting there that may surprise you as a name that could be sitting at 18 if the Mavs decide to stay there?
Yeah, I could see Tyrese Maxey from Kentucky being there. He's touted as the guy, Kentucky every year has a guy who's hidden essentially there, that he underperforms at Kentucky, but completely overexceeds expectations in the NBA. So he could be one. He's kind of Marcus Smart light build. I could also see Grant Riller from College of Charleston. He's just an unbelievably polished offensive player, 3-level scorer, played at a small school, so there's big concern about that. 4-year guy, 6'1". But he's skilled enough, and I think he translates pretty well.
And for the kinds of players that you would want to surround Luka Doncic in terms of a playmaker, would you want to see a guard being able to be paired with him, or would you rather see an athletic wing who can score be paired with Luka Doncic to try and accentuate his ability as a passer in terms of playmaking skills?
Yeah, that's a tough question because I think both are definitely needs. I think I would go with a wing, kind of someone who can just make Luka's job easier. And I think the wing does that more effectively than a guard.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things I know watching him, especially this past season, someone who could potentially take some of that pressure off of him in terms of some of the playmaking to lessen some of that usage rate. He had one of the highest usage rates in all of the NBA last year. And maybe a veteran point guard through trade or free agency or trying to find a young guard in the draft may be able to take some of that pressure off of him. Is that needed for him, for Luka Doncic going into this upcoming year, knowing how much of a usage rate that he had last year, especially when you look at those numbers?
Yeah, I think so. And with Porzingis likely missing, some time this year with the knee injury, I do think they need to surround him with as many weapons as absolutely possible. And it helps with the bench when just the overall offense gets stagnant. We saw it so many times, especially in the last parts of the game where it was just dry offense. And their number one offense ever, I think, according to offensive rating. But at times it just still went too dry, and that's a solution is to get an offensive-minded guard who can just create his own shots.
And then for going into this upcoming season, obviously decisions have to be made with guys like a Dwight Powell, whether or not they will move on from him coming off of a torn Achilles himself. Guys like DeLon Wright, Tim Hardaway Jr. has a player option himself. What do you think the makeup of this team will look like by the time we get to December 22nd when the NBA season starts?
Man, that is the hardest question I think I'll be asked all day. Because the Mavs always have turnover one way or another. It feels like there's not much retention for most of the roster. I do think they're primed to make a good trade. 18 and 31 are valuable assets, especially this year with how deep the draft is. The only problem is it's tricky to trade with the CBA and everything. Those picks, they owe a pick next year. So I do like the trade potential they have. I'd say probably out of those guys you listed, two of them are back. I would say Powell is there just because I don't know if you can trade him. Tim Hardaway Jr. though, he's a big question mark with that player option. That's a very movable contract.
And do you think, as far as the Mavs are concerned, especially when you start projecting toward the future, everyone's on the Giannis thing, but Giannis potentially be coming to Dallas. Is it a situation, if you were GM, if you were Donnie Nelson, do you say, look, we're going to go all in right now. We've got a championship window open with Luka Doncic. We're going to go in and try and find our third star now. Or do you say, look, let's wait one more year. Let's get to 2021 and let's see what we could potentially do in trying to get Giannis to come here or try and convince him to come to Dallas?
Yeah, it's tough. I think I'm in the camp of wait till 2021, just kind of ride out this year, get as much as you can, of course, in the meantime, but don't necessarily go out of your way to sell as much of the farm as possible just to do so. You kind of have to be smart with it and be efficient with your assets.
How would you assess the depth in this draft? Is it more top heavy? Is it more of a balanced draft? Going through your draft work, how have you seen this draft as far as a depth is concerned?
Yeah, so I'd say the top 10 are it's a below average top of the class. Most of those guys would be end of lottery guys any other year or mid teens, excuse me. But from about 15 to 20 all the way to 50, I'd say there's very little gap. There's an argument for most of those guys to be taken anywhere in that range. There's someone who has probably first round grade for me that might go almost undrafted. There's also the opposite where guys who have in the 50s might go in the first round. And it's not a knock. It's just, it's very hard to separate any of these players from each other.
And what has your mock drafts told you? I know you've been pouring through mock drafts, trying to get this stuff together as we get ready for November 18th for the Mavs. What has been kind of the consensus as far as your mock drafts are concerned, given where the Mavs are and where they'll be picking?
Yeah, the guy I keep coming back to is Josh Green. I think that's right in his wheelhouse range. I think it starts at 15 with Portland or 16 with Portland, excuse me, and could go anywhere down to Utah at 23. And I think Dallas is right there for him. Freshman, he's young, the high upside, the defense, it's just all what Dallas needs.
And ideally, who would you like to see if you had, look, you have free reign, obviously, excluding like the LaMelo Balls of the world and some of the other top draft picks. Who is that one guy you say, you know what, this is the guy that if I'm picking and he's there, I'm taking?
So this might be cheating the answer, but if you can trade up to about 11 or 12 and he's there, which is possible, I would take Devin Vassell from Florida State. I think he's a generational defender. He just has no defensive flaws, and he still has to add a lot of weight, which is just I can't really emphasize how good of a defender he will be day one. He reminds me of Matisse Thybulle a lot, who has gotten a lot of attention around the league for how good defensively he is. And I think just immediately Dallas gets so much better on the defensive end from him alone.
Yeah, this is a defense last year that finished 18th in the NBA. Could definitely use some perimeter defenders to help make this team that much more balanced. Richard, last question before we let you get out of here. What are your overall expectations for the Mavs with respect to not only this draft and free agency that you would like to see them do by the time we get to the start of the 2020 NBA season?
I hope I don't necessarily have a specific vision. I hope they improve. Like, this is a weak answer, but I really do hope they improve the end of the bench. There's a lot of guys that we saw kind of towards the end of the year that they just weren't performing to where the roster spot indicated they should have. If you can get true 8th, 9th, 10th men to perform that level, I think that's going to take the team to another level.
Well, we will see if the Mavs can increase that bench. Can they find themselves getting a nice prospect at the 18th spot, or maybe even move up to potentially get a late lottery draft pick? The NBA draft starts on November the 18th. The Dallas Mavericks pick at number 18 and also have the 31st selection in this year's NBA draft. You can follow him on Twitter at Mavs Draft, and he is also the co-host of the Mavs Draft podcast. His name is Richard Stayman. Richard, thank you so much for the time, man, and we'll see on November 18th if these Mavs can handle their business in this draft.
Hopefully. Thank you so much for having me.
Appreciate it.